So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and I've been given another couple of scenarios from Tommy the Wise, and this is the first of the two that he has given me, dubbed Numenor Beach, and it's going to be another beach landing one, so not too dissimilar perhaps to the situation we saw between Dorwinion and it was Linden, wasn't it, in the recreation of the Troy beach assault, albeit this one is something that you might expect to see in Middle-earth if the Orcs of Mordor were somehow able to make landfall on the island of Numenor, which seems somewhat unlikely, but it is still perhaps more plausible than Linden and Dorwinion fighting on a beach somewhere. But yes, going to be an interesting one this, because once again we're going to be seeing a relatively similar sort of situation here where defending a beach like this, while it is open, these stakes do offer solid cover, so Orcs won't be able to pass through them. So there are more severe choke points on their passage up the beach than perhaps would be ideal for the Orcs, but you can already see there is a very substantial numbers advantage that Mordor are going to have over here with one of the Numenor armies trying to defend from the front, and several other Mordor armies are already surrounding the Numenor fort, which is guarding this beach, so clearly they have already managed to penetrate beach defences elsewhere. Plenty of Mordor armies already right up against the walls, so once again from one of Tommy's scenarios we're seeing things get right underway very quickly, which I do appreciate. It's a pretty quick battle in many ways, just shy of 17,000 frames for something which is, there's a lot of players involved, so it's going to be a very violent one once again. And once again, another hallmark of the scenarios that he's had a tendency to make over the course of the past few months is that there's always a reinforcing army for the defenders, and on this occasion it is going to be the Elves of Imladris, so the Elves of course no strangers to seafaring either, so a little bit more understandable that they would be able to find their way to Numenor and, well, the fair Isle of Numenor I suppose. But yeah, Imladris with their high quality army, not very numerous of course, but the quality that they have, and it's going to be, especially for Diego Rio Ramos over there, it's going to be fairly difficult for him to go about his business. And speaking of which, we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, and we'll start with Diego's army as well. So it is going to be 5, I believe, Mordor armies, 2 Numenor and 1 reinforcing Imladris army on the defence. But yes, the Orcs of Mordor. So Orc Maulers with the armour upgrade, armour piercing. It's certainly not going to go to waste against any of the factions that are on the defence today, though the quality of really all of the defending armies is going to be a little bit much for the Orc Maulers to make a huge impression. Although they will be a little bit more useful against Numenor. Numenor may be a little bit more reliant on their armour than the Elves, but not by much, honestly. The Numenorian stats are still going to be just fine. One thing that Numenor maybe do have against them is they don't have a particularly large supply of ammunition from some of their mid to upper tier archers. And archers are of course one of the best ways in which you can deal with a unit such as this. Minas Morgul chosen just in front of them, very much the bulwark of the main Mordor infantry force. They're fairly expensive in comparison to many of the other rank and file Mordor units, but very thick armour, able to stand and fight for a long period of time. Not necessarily the best damage dealers, especially not against high quality factions such as the ones they're going to be facing off against today, but still invaluable to be that hard centre to the Mordor horde. Morannon halberds, which will be useful as well, albeit again Numenor and Imladris do have access to really high-end pikes. Numenor also have access to some regular ones as well, so range may very well be an issue, but Mordor, for a phalanx unit, the Morannon halberds are really their only option. The armour piercing will be nice as well for the reasons that we have already covered, though once again they have pretty much the same weaknesses really as the Orc Maulers, though they do have more staying power in melee because of that phalanx, especially if they are part of a general advance of Mordor with the numbers acting as they should. Morannon infantry, the standard Mordor infantry unit, numerous, far from the worst sword and board unit in the game as well at doing this sort of thing, so they can look after themselves, though once again when it comes to one unit on one unit combat, the Morannon infantry will find themselves far outclassed by the sort of thing that Numenor and Imladris can bring to the table. But the best thing about playing as Mordor in this situation is it's not going to be 1 unit versus 1 unit, it's more going to be 2 on 1 at worst for you, potentially 3 on 1. So that's the sort of numbers that Mordor can bring to the table, and they will be looking to swarm over the fortress in double quick time. Morannon Guard are the spear variant of the unit we were just talking about, so they do have that spear malice to contend with. If there are any cavalry units on the field for the defenders, which we know there are in Imladris at the very least, the anti-cavalry bonus may very well come into effect, but for the most part in infantry combat they are going to be less effective at doing damage, and ultimately, while spears are a bit better defensively than their regular infantry counterparts, the stat discrepancy is still going to be so high that it's going to be quite difficult for them to really showcase that. Orc Javelins, a very useful unit for attackers to utilise in many situations. The armour-piercing damage they're capable of doing, very, very useful. It's the sort of thing which you really don't want to be using your ammunition on as defenders either. So a real conundrum to have to try and solve here, as it always is with these cheap javelin units. One of the most effective units that you can have as the attackers, because they're one of the most deceptively easy units to use in the game, at least in a siege situation like this. Maybe a little bit less cut and dry on the open field where cavalry is far more of a threat, but we'll see if Imladris can handle that for them. The Olag High are also here, so they need to be a bit careful because against high quality focused forces, trolls can be burnt down pretty quickly in terms of the damage that's coming their way, but if they are committed at the right time they can do a lot of damage, and especially to quality focused defences like this as well. They can't afford to take the level of damage that trolls can do quickly if Mordor have managed to seize the momentum by that point. We will see. Moran on archers, in terms of skirmishing, Mordor will of course come out second best against both of the defending armies today, though it isn't quite so simple. Imladris and Numenor have got very expensive archer forces, and in Numenor's case their mainline upper tier archer and the Numenorian steel bows don't have much ammunition at all, so protracted skirmishing is more the wheelhouse of their descendants in Umbar. But again, considering the length of the battle and considering how quickly Mordor are going to have to move, I don't think protracted skirmishing is really going to be their friend here. It's just going to be an incidental bit of ranged support, I think, more than anything else. Sauron's Will are going to forego some of the weaknesses that the Orc Maulers, their lower tier brethren, have. They have better stats, they're of course going to be able to do more damage, very large, perhaps overly so, serrated axes that the Sauron's Will do wield. They are still going to hold some of the same weaknesses though, and in terms of outright quality they will still struggle against quite a few of the defenders, but especially against the mainline upper tier Numenor units, the Sauron's Will do represent a more genuine threat to their continued existence. We do have some cavalry as well. The Melkor's Chosen, so this will be a very good defensive unit of cavalry for the attackers. They can use it to ward off any sort of rear charges from Imladris, they can use it to contain any sort of cavalry that Numenor may want to sally forth with as well. And yeah, very effective unit of cavalry. They didn't do so well in the fairly recent knockout tourney for melee cavalry. They got eliminated in the first round, in fact, but that was against similar units to themselves, and there isn't really something on the same level as the Melkor's Chosen that these armies can field. Armour piercing once again from the Uruk captains. Fairly unremarkable looking unit, but fairly deceptive because that armour piercing does set them apart from other units of this type, and they should be, again, they're a pretty dependable kind of unit, this for Mordor. Again, they will be outclassed by the equivalent units from Numenor and Imladris, as you would expect, but it's about the whole package with Mordor, I should say. If they can build their army and offense correctly, the numbers will do a fair amount of the heavy lifting for you, as long as your morale doesn't fall apart. And I think on the other side of the army we're seeing much the same sort of thing. So yeah, Maulers, Minas Morgul's Chosen, Halberds, Moran on infantry, and then Moran on guard. So decent spread of units this. Moran on Halberds in decent numbers. So moving on to the second army. This is an interesting unit to see. So we've got Portaleno. I actually think I've got a free-for-all from him coming up just after this one, which I've already recorded. Not my finest work, sadly. I was a little bit ill that day, but it is what it is. The Beasts of Gorgoroth, though, are actually a much improved unit in the upcoming new patch, but in this version of the game they are terrible. So I don't know how Portaleno is going to be getting on with this, because they have all the weaknesses of the Muma kill, only it's exacerbated because they're even more fragile, and they tend to run amok very quickly. Technically the javelins that they throw should be more effective than the arrows of the Muma kill, but that is cold comfort for this kind of unit, and I'm sure we'll see them crumble pretty quickly, but we'll see. Once again, more Sauron's Will, so yeah, more armour piercing. We'll go through this army a little bit more quickly because we've seen the vast majority of these units now. Orc Maulers with yet more armour piercing, plenty of armour piercing in fact, with more Maulers, more Sauron's Will, some Orc Archers as well, so the lower tier option in comparison to the Moran Archers. Like I said, protracted skirmishing and going for this numbers focused range approach, which the attackers can often do if they want to bog the battle down and it takes a long time, but we already know, because of the amount of frames in the battle, that is not going to happen, so they're going to have to just do what damage they can quickly in support of their relatively numerous infantry force. Moran on infantry, we've got some Orc fodder at the front, interesting omission from the previous army, though of course in melee terms, spears, so not going to be doing much damage at all, they're just here for the numbers, and yeah, being the meat shield in every sense of the word. Moran on infantry, more halberds, more javelins, a useful unit as we already know. Uruk captains are there as well. This is going to be a particularly dangerous unit. The Blackguard of Barad-dûr can be very, very useful for Mordor. They can claim the momentum in a fight by using this unit with their mass pushing capability, and then from there it can be quite difficult to recover from if they use it at the right time. If they use it at the wrong time, however, they can evaporate pretty quickly, especially considering the quality the defenders do have. But it's going to be difficult for the defenders. There's only one Numenor army that has to withstand these attacks. Imladris will be arriving momentarily, but still, the very start of this battle could end up being very, very key. The Temple Executioners, one of the few units that can go toe-to-toe with the very best that Numenor have to offer, especially with that armour upgrade. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising, because these are Numenorians themselves, of course, corrupted Numenorians that occupy Durthaim. Then we have some Orc Javelins again, Orc Archers. I imagine it's going to be the same sort of thing. Morannon Infantry, Fodder, Infantry, Halberds, Orc Archers. So not the most high quality army, a few units of danger spread throughout that army, but mostly just going to be here for the numbers, which is still a very useful thing. T.S. Niehoff represents the final Mordor army which are menacing the castle here. Morannon Guard, we have some Morannon Infantry as well, 3 units of them in behind another unit of Morannon Guard. Once again, we have some upgraded Temple Executioners, so they're certainly not without quality here, Mordor, though they're not completely oversaturated with it either. We've got some Mountain Trolls, which is interesting. We very rarely get to see the Mountain Trolls because, you know, the Olak-hai are the ones that you're going to bring if you have the choice every single time, because they're worth the extra money and then some in comparison. But still, once you get given them, you've assigned your compositions in a custom scenario like this, so you have to make do with what you've got. So the Mountain Trolls, the supermarket own brand version, are going to have to do here, but they'll still be fine. They will still do damage, though they will get killed fairly quickly against higher quality units from the defenders. Halberds, more infantry, so plenty of the Morannon units here. Minas Morgul's Chosen, Orc Javelins, we have Morannon Archers, we have another very dangerous unit, Blackguard of Barad-dûr, like I said. Probably one of the scariest units Mordor have in their arsenal, actually, in this kind of battle. Orc Maulers, another unit of Uruk Captains, and yeah, Maulers and Spears and Javelins. So, meanwhile, by the beach, the 2 armies which will take a little while getting to the fort, but we'll see if their fellows are able to make good progress before they even get there. We have the Warlord, once again, Morannon Guard out in front. Shields ready to accept the barrage that's going to be coming their way, I'm sure. More Morannon Guard, more Morannon Infantry as well as the second wave, so no danger of them running low on numbers quickly. But Morannon Halberds and Orc Maulers making up a decent portion of the army. They are softer targets for the Numenorians to go after, and more dangerous ones, of course, with the armour piercing they both have. Orc Archers will be hoping to get some shots off, and easier in the more open terrain that the beach offers, even if they are downhill of the Numenorians. Mountain Trolls, once again, Maulers, again the Blackguard of Barad-dûr, which, considering how thinly spread Numenor are, it's going to be a difficult task to keep Mordor in check here. Sauron's Will at the back, more Sauron's Will. And then moving on to the final attacking army before we take a look at the defenders. We have her Tumihai, so the Orc Fodder already starting to sprint up the hill, wasting no time, 35 frames in, to start pressurising the Numenorian front line. 2 units of Fodder backed up by the Morannon Infantry. He has got the Olak-hai, so he may not have the slightly better spears on the front, but he's got the significantly better troll unit to try and put the pressure on the Numenorian front line. Halberds, Morannon Archers, so slightly better archers as well. Halberds, Javelins, Minas Morgul's Chosen, the armour piercing of the Sauron's Will. Less armour piercing in this army, you'd have to say, with less Maulers, but perhaps a little bit more well-rounded with the kind of ranged units he has, especially the Orc Javelins. And then at the back we also have the Uruk Captains offering a well-balanced bodyguard unit. So, the defending army from the beach is going to be Tommy himself, the scenario creator. So he has got some Numenorian Shield Guard on the front. They will be very effective against Mordor, of course. Most of Mordor's defensive abilities come from the armour that they patch together. And so the armour piercing that the Numenorian Shield Guard add to the very solid defensive nature of upper end spears like this means they're pretty much the ideal front line, especially if Numenor can back them up appropriately. Trolls can be damaged by the armour piercing, but you would rather something else as well to help deal with the significant threat that they represent. The Numenorian cohort, by comparison, don't have the armour piercing, but they will be ideal for mowing their way through the Morannon units because they have got high base damage, even for the tier of unit they are, which is a high tier unit. They do have higher base damage than most line infantry of this type. And that aggression of the Numenorians may serve them well here because they already hold a very good defensive advantage over most of what Mordor have to offer as well. More Numenorian Shield Guard there. Another important unit to the front line going to be the Seafarers of Nindamos, the Javelin damage. Very, very useful here for going after individual targets, and then they're decent in melee. Not the sort of thing that you can bet your house on, certainly, but they will still do a decent amount of damage, again, especially to the more numerous Mordor units. If they do come up against the higher tiers, though, they will struggle more so than their upper end brethren. Speaking of which, though, that's exactly the sort of thing which a unit like the Pharazim Swordmasters are going to be for, because they outmatch anything Mordor have. Even the Temple Executioners with their upgraded armour are going to be wilting in the face of a third hit point that the Pharazim Swordmasters bring to the table. So we shall see how the battle treats them. I would imagine they're going to do pretty well out of it. The Numenorean steel bows are already firing. I mean, the Mordor army is in full view, so they can pick and choose their target right away, but they need to be going after high tier units. We've already briefly mentioned they don't have the best arm or ammunition values. Their armour values are just fine. But yeah, I mean, they're decent in melee when their ammunition is gone, but not really to the same extent that Elven projectiles are. They're kind of a disappointing unit in most situations, though this is a chance for them to shine because they can hit whatever target they choose pretty much. The Trebuchet is going to have to start utilising its ammunition pretty quickly, because I do think Numenor are living a rather charmed existence right from the start here. Tommy has got to spread himself fairly wide against two dense Mordor forces. Mass is going to be Mordor's friend everywhere on the battlefield here. It's going to be a race against time for the defenders. If they can consolidate, and if they can stifle Mordor's momentum, then stuff like the Trebuchet here and the projectiles that all of the defending armies can bring to bear will be a bit of a difference maker. Ardenheim shadow bows, of course, rangers capable of dealing damage quickly, but is it going to be quick enough to stop Mordor from moving forwards? Pikes, especially really high-end pikes like the Naru and Aru Sentinels, one of the best units of pikes that the game has to offer, considering that shield value they have. Very, very good defensively. But is it going to be enough? I mean, pikes tend to make the battle protracted. Is that going to be something they're capable of doing on the beach here? Pharazim Nobles, which do have that slightly better charge bonus when compared to other sword cavalry, which is going to be their main use here. As soon as Mordor start to breach the lines, the cavalry can slap them back down again, potentially. More Naru and Aru Sentinels. We've got another unit, Pharazim Swordmasters, so quality is not an issue. If they can, like I say, stifle Mordor's momentum, then that could be how they win this, but Mordor will be doing everything in their power to prevent that. Seafarers of Nindamos once again. We have another unit of Numenorian steel bows and a second trebuchet. Interesting compositions this. I mean, he's got the tools, it's just whether or not he's able to withstand the pressure. Then we have Hidden ZZ, who is going to be playing as another Numenor army. Interesting to see here, this is a unit that you only really see in custom scenarios like this, the Numenor variant of the Temple Guard with their brass armour. So armour-piercing projectiles and a very strong unit in melee as well. Could be useful. We'll have to wait and see. We have the Alcarondas Faithful, another unit that they gain access to when all eras is turned on, something which they then share with Umbar, in addition to the Temple Guard we've already seen from Mordor. Belagaya Footmen are a functional unit of spears, but certainly not going to be match winners here. It's just going to be a case of numbers, which is useful in its own way, considering the overwhelming numbers advantage Mordor have. Another unit that they share with their Umbar brethren is the Alcarondas Legion, albeit decked out in Numenor colours, so the darker, sort of very dark blue and grey that you would associate with them. Another technically non-Umbar unit in the Temple Executioners we've already seen, but again, brass armour signifies them as Numenorian on this occasion. Belagaya Footman, more Alcarondas Legion, so most of the units we don't get to see in Numenor colours are here today. Another unit of Temple Guard, more Alcarondas Legion, a very high quality army this. And considering how condensed this fortress is, maybe they can consolidate and hold out until the Elves arrive, we'll see. More Temple Executioners, Naru and Aru Royal Guard, fantastic in a long skirmish fight, a very tanky unit indeed, but we'll have to wait and see. Brass armour that we usually see from the Royal Legion of Armenelos, which are of course a part of the standard Numenor roster, a very good bodyguard, sword and board infantry as well. Enhanced numbers in their roster. Alcarondas Legion once again. We've got Belagaya Pikemen, which can try and lock down those front lines as Numenor push forward. I mean, the quality is definitely here for Numenor. As I said, a couple of units of Royal Legion of Armenelos, plenty of Alcarondas Legion. We shall wait and see. So if they can stifle Mordor, like I said, it's a similar story here. The situation is largely going to depend on how well Numenor can hold out and how well Imladris can start the domino effect on the Mordor armies around the fort, I think. With Filler here, who has got some Elder spearmen, certainly Imladris will not be left behind by Numenor in terms of quality. In fact, Imladris will be left behind by nobody. I think there isn't really a faction in the game which sort of champions quality over quantity more than Imladris, I would say. You can go for a more numerous army as Imladris, but it's one of those situations where very rarely I would recommend it. Elder Spearmen, several units of them on the front line. I mean, they're going to be very difficult to kill. One of the best high-end non-bodyguard spears in the game. The Elder as a class of unit tends to have that quality. And it's going to be mostly an Elder army that's here. Plenty of Elder Spearmen. Elder archers are in behind as well, so this is going to be something else which Mordor are not going to be too thankful for as they move forward. Plenty of damage coming off them. Of course, they're pretty damn good in melee as well. One of the unit models that has managed to last ever since vanilla. Much in the same way as the Golden Boys from Rune, the Elder have maintained their vanilla nature, and you can certainly see why. It's a fantastic looking unit. Very faithful to the movies, of course. Elder Swordmasters, plenty of them as well. So a very straightforward army this, entirely Elder and a couple of Elder Lancers as well. Do they have a unit of Knights? No, just Elder Lancers. So that may be a little bit of a concern. Elder Lancers are not really going to enjoy facing off against the Melkor's Chosen, but considering the amount of arrow fire that is probably going to be dousing the Melkor's Chosen, they should be fine, but maybe a little bit of a stumbling block. But yeah, this is going to be interesting. I have a feeling that it's really going to come down to whether Mordor can overwhelm the Numenorians really, really quickly, or whether as soon as Imladris arrive, Mordor start to crumble, because the quality level of the defenders is extremely high. So if they can't carry that momentum quickly, it's actually a more dangerous situation for the attackers than you may think. It's not often that we see a time limit. Well, in a scenario we may do, but there is actually a time limit of sorts in this battle, I think, for the attackers to truly lay down their marker, and it may be the beach that they actually are able to do that best on, because Tommy is a little bit more isolated from his fellows. Imladris will be able to reinforce hidden ZZ more quickly perhaps, but I guess without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So this is going to be a very quick start to this battle, and like I said, I imagine we're going to be spending most of this one going at half speed, purely because of how fast it's going to be and how much action there's going to be across the entire field, with a few missiles already coming forth to hit the Orc fodder, which maybe isn't the best of choices when it comes to attacking one of these units. After all, like I said, there's no real cover for the Orcs here, so you should be going after something that's maybe a little bit more important than the Orc fodder, which is going to be absolutely no problem for the Numenor infantry to deal with. Numenorian cohorts in particular are going to be very, very adept at carving their way through these lower end Orcs, and then moving across. There is a lot of these. And moving forwards, the Moranons will be a little bit better off when it comes to trying to deal, or keep themselves alive, I suspect, against the Numenorian lines. But as mentioned, for Mordor, it's just going to be a case of trying to overwhelm these defences, because it is quite a large area for Tommy to try and look after, and it is over here that things may be a little bit doomed for Numenor. It's just going to be a case of how many Orcs can actually kill on these beaches and prevent any more units from arriving at attacking the fort. And speaking of which, over here, while Portolano's army is right next to the walls, there's no actual siege equipment here for them to utilise, which is actually a very good point. I don't know if they've actually got any way that they can get in through these gatehouses now that I look at it. Do they have any rams and the like? Do they have any artillery? Because that may be an issue for them. Otherwise they simply won't be able to get in, which would be a little bit of a shame, but still, the gatehouses are the only two ways in for them without the use of ladders and the like. But back on the beaches themselves, Numenorian cohorts going to continue to chop through the Orc fodder, some of them managing to spill around the sides already, which, as we've already mentioned, is going to be one of the main methods that Mordor are going to have to utilise here on the beach. Go back up to 1 speed for the time being, until the action at the fort is also underway, and we will need to be switching back and forth between them a little bit more readily. The artillery already firing as well, which I think Tommy's going to need to use this ammunition in the artillery very, very quickly. There's no sense in trying to save it, because wheeling it back to the fortress is going to be very, very difficult. The fortress is already largely surrounded, and you're going to have to go through Mordor units just to get back in behind the walls anyway, so it's now or never for the artillery, in many ways. Some trolls also on the front line already. Mountain trolls, you can see that the Numenorian shield guard, as strong as they are, the sheer weight of numbers already leaving this, well, and that's very unfortunate to have the artillery hit really only your own men, given how thin the line actually is. It is the risk that you take with artillery, but maybe there are better choices of targets here. And actually we will need to go back down to half speed already, I feel. With the Blackguard of Barad-dûr on the way forward, Pharazim Swordmasters on the way as well, but big gaps already. And Numenor need to play this slightly more competently, I think, otherwise it's not going to last too much longer. The Numenor Sentinels really ought to have been sent forward onto these choke points right from the very start, I feel. And then we also have more of the regular units. Morannon Halberdiers, which there are Numenorian pikes, as we've already said, but they're not going to be able to cover every single choke point, so the Halberd's going to be very good at trying to equalise the fight between themselves and the cohort. A little bit further across, meanwhile, we've got these Numenorian shield guards who are taking hits from the Orc javelins. They're going to have to reposition themselves, and then Orc fodder as well. So Mordor heading towards the walls, but like I said, is there any way in for them? Can they get in? I don't know if they can. Is that a little bit of an oversight? And there's also the approaching Elven forces as well, which we will have to be on the lookout for. But so far, I'd say the defenders around the fortress are not too worried, but certainly on the beach things could end up getting a little bit dicey for them fairly quickly. Defeat's still a distinct possibility for these Orc fodder, but that's not really too much of a concern. I really don't like the juddering effect that seems to happen on occasion when you go down to half speed, but again, more friendly fire, and a large part of it is to do with the angle, I think, of the beach. It's so steep that in order to hit their units, they have to go through the back of his own men, and so far, it's unlucky, I suppose, for the trebuchet, but partly you do have to question what targets are being selected. If you're selecting the unit that's right next to your own men, you're kind of asking for trouble if you're doing that. More of the trebuchet, however, is doing some good damage over here, standing several units of Orcs routing. And we did notice briefly the Blackguard of Barad-dûr were under arrow fire from the steel bows previously. The Pharazim Swordmasters on the front line. Actually, the Mountain Trolls are also still very much alive as well. The Seafarer is going to try and move backwards a little bit out of ammunition, steel bows, to help shore things up on the front line. Defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. The psychological impact of the artillery probably just as useful here as the actual damage that's being done. Nice little charge as well from the Pharazim nobles. Their more aggressive edge in comparison to other sword cavalry should serve them pretty well here, clattering into the side of these Orc maulers. Elsewhere, Blackguard still in decent shape, but that will change as the Pharazim Swordmasters continue to move forward. I'm surprised actually that Mordor are not just pushing everything through this gap they've now created. There's captains back there which could be useful. But so far, could have gone better for Numenor, certainly with regards to that friendly fire with the artillery, but it could also have gone far worse. Mordor still very early in this battle, but still, meanwhile. The first engagement's also happening in what's basically a little mini field battle that's going to be happening here between one of the Mordor armies and the advancing Eldarenwe force. You can see in the background over there, Porta Leno. They're all gathering around the gates, and the gates are still very much shut. No rams. I feel like that means that the Numenorians will kind of have to open the gates to allow Mordor in. That does seem like a bit of an oversight, but ran on guard. Going to have to, well, they're not going to last too long against a spear of the Eldarenwe's quality. Over here we can see this isn't even like the more modern Total Wars where you can send forward a unit of infantry to chop your way through the gatehouses. I imagine this is the conversation that's being had in-game as we speak, like how on earth are we supposed to get in through this, or is this just a gatehouse that you can pass through? Okay, yes it is. So the gate, for all intents and purposes, is open / non-existent, which is a good thing for the mechanics of the game, because otherwise, you know, they wouldn't be able to get into the fortress. But Mordor are going to be moving in, and Hidden Zed is now going to have to withstand the initial assaults, as Porta Leno will also be doing the same. As we head back down to the beach, Numenor Sentinels helping to shore things up on this choke point. Tumahai's force being stifled as well. But the Olag High have certainly done their job here, managing to bludgeon their way through. Though the Numenorians, it's only really the Olag High that have managed to do so. The Numenorians still have enough infantry to salvage that position. Meanwhile, Sauron's Will on the way forward, though that there is the Ardenheim Shadow Bows. Sauron's Will and Morannon Halberds represent a very good target for them indeed. Further along the beach as well, still several positions still holding. Where Mordor have made the most progress is over here. The Pharazim Swordmasters still slowly but surely chunking away at the Trolls and the Blackguard, though some of the Morannon infantry that's returned from routing now getting back into the fight, though they won't last too long. The Seafarers, like I said, are competent melee combatants, and they should be able to deal with these bloodied orcs. You can see already things are not looking so good with this Mordor front line. They needed to go more front heavy in this army, I think, from Diego. I know that his quality is such that the Elves are always going to win this, but maybe trying to go for a little bit more of a layered approach wasn't really ideal when you consider the level to which Imladris are going to be operating here. Especially those Eldarenway Swordmasters, they're going to be massively problematic for the orcs on the front line. Eldarenway Lancers managing to get a nice charge into the Sauron's Will, which were trying to take an aggressive stance against some of the gaps in the Elven line. No such danger for them now, though. Continued charging. There's still the matter of those Melkor's Chosen, which is an area where Mordor maybe do hold an advantage over Imladris on horseback here. Sauron's will give a better accounting of themselves, certainly, than the regular units that Mordor are having to deal with in the middle, but you can see already here that the forward momentum very much with Imladris. It seems like the stronger units for Mordor are actually on the flanks here, but Imladris focusing in the middle, which means their formations are going to start to crumble fairly fast, you would say. The Olakai, again, Eldarenway Swordmasters are wavering considering the numbers. In an isolated engagement, Swordmasters should be pretty good against the Olakai, but the support of the Minas Morgul's Chosen and slightly isolated nature out here on the flank does mean that Mordor are having some success. And Imladris won't be able to get through this without cost, but they should be able to do so. And then they will probably be able to start relieving a bit of pressure on the fortress as the Eldarenway Lancers come crashing through the back of these Orc Javelins. The best thing for dealing with cheap javelins is cavalry, if it is an option for you. Still the trebuchets firing away. Still, by the looks of things, Numenor are just about holding on, but you can see more and more there's more examples of Mordor units starting to break through the initial defences on the beach barricades. Defeat seems certain as well for them. And over here, one of the defences seems to have pretty much completely crumbled. Unfortunately there, that trebuchet shot went sailing over, though that one went right through. Numenorian Shield Guard still fighting hard. And then over here, still a few units left. Morannon Infantry broken, Seafarers. Yeah, Mordor still has a little bit of work to do over here. The support of this cavalry is certainly not making things easy, so Mordor, things are poised quite nicely here, because I do still think Mordor will win the beach battle, but it will come at maybe a greater cost than they were hoping for. Pharazim Swordmasters charging in, charging through the Olakai. I don't really know what they're doing there, but I'm going over to try and relieve the trebuchet crew with the orcs still there. Some units going flying. The Blackguard of Barad-dûr pushing in, a healthier unit of them still alive. Meanwhile, back here in the fortress, things have developed pretty quickly. As you would expect, a very aggressive push into the fort by T.S. Niehoff. Alcarondas Legion, Temple Executioners and the like. We already mentioned how strong this force looked, but again, it's all a matter of numbers here. The amount of orcs they're going to have to kill in order to have any sort of success in this battle is going to be very, very substantial. Trolls up on the wall, but they're going after Temple Guard. They're doing damage, but surely the Temple Guard should be enough to finish them off. They'd much rather the Naru Royal Guard be the ones tied up in melee, I think, because the Temple Guard's armour-piercing arrows would be very, very useful for doing an enhanced level of damage to certain targets. They're pushing forwards Mordor, but they are in danger of overextending themselves, leaving themselves a little thin in areas, and then you could start to see parts of their line crumble. Alcarondas faithful are there, Royal Legion, very similar story over here with a very aggressive push, though Portaleno, it's not a rout. I think this is a situation where he's selected all of his units and is trying to move them all in one, and then the pathfinding in Medieval 2 kind of goes a little bit haywire at that point. Beast of Gorgoroth are right in and amongst things here, and being used as like mobile javelin towers is probably the best use for them, because as soon as they go into melee they're going to start dying and running amok. Like we said, very, very weak in this version of the game, though that will be changing for the upcoming new patch. They've been made far more effective alongside other such monstrous units as the Mumakil. Well, up here on the walls, Nara and Iron Royal Guard continuing to try and fire. They should be just fine along with Temple Guard at dealing with Morannon infantry units. Temple Guard trying to leave the area. Temple Executioners are also here as well, so the fortress very much under pressure at this point. They are going to need the backup of the Elves at some point. There is always the danger that Mordor do mass rout in this situation as well, though, which is worth bearing in mind. Orc Maulers, Halberds, a lot of units which are pretty susceptible to arrow fire, though there's still units that are outside the walls as well, archers they may be, but more fuel for the fire. Having a look at the situation on the beach, some of the front lines still going in Numenor's favour actually, but surely with the organisation being in the state that it's in, that says that Mordor are eventually going to start cracking their way through, but again, have they done enough damage here, Numenor, to Mordor? More damage will be done between now and when Mordor can make it to help try and take the fortress, so we'll have to wait and see. I think the performance of the artillery here may be a bit of a difference maker. I think the rest of the Numenor army on the beach really has pulled its weight. We'll see at the end of the battle what kill counts are like, but the friendly fire on those trebuchets, could that be key moving into the final stages? We'll have to wait and see. Moving across the rest of the battlefield, there's still quite a lot of Pharazim nobles, which Mordor will have to try and, I think, completely surround and destroy in such a fashion. Olag High now heading over here to try and finally silence the second trebuchet. What's going on over here then as Imladris move forward? See, the battle has progressed pretty much as you would expect. The quality really has shown itself. What remains of Diego's army is scattered pockets of resistance at this stage. Did okay on the flanks here, but ultimately it was always going to be merely buying time so that his allies could try and make significant gains in the fortress before Imladris arrived. And he's done a decent job at that because the fortress is under serious pressure, and Imladris do need to get a bit of a move on to assist their Numenor allies within the walls. And it's not as if Imladris have managed to get away with this completely scot-free either. Their army does look significantly smaller than it once did. There's a lot of Eldarenway archers, which maybe won't be as useful within the fortress as you would hope. Morannon Halberds returning. I think that is Diego's general, perhaps. Eldarenway Spearmen on that side. Back towards the fortress then. What is the situation? Portaleno's full army is now inside the walls, and you can see the territory being gained here. It was always going to be a tough task for Hidden Zed to try and hold back the tide as well as he can. Still some units around the outside of it as well. Things looking maybe a little bit better for Numenor over here. I think the idea is to stack up more heavily on this side and hope Imladris' reinforcements arrive on the other side to bail you out of that particular predicament. Not a bad idea, but it only works if Imladris is able to hurry up. Orc javelins in behind enemy lines, hitting the rear of the Numenor forces now, which is giving them the leg up they need. All of the Morannon units still fighting hard. Over here, some of the units moving over to try and link up with Portaleno's army. Alcarondas faithful within the walls, going to charge in, but again, the room they have, and also the fact they are more of a full-on sword cavalry unit. They don't really have an aggressive streak in them like the Pharazim nobles, so really just going to be a delaying measure here. Further up on the walls, what do we have? the Numenor Royal Guard. So these trolls have done a really good job actually, considering they're just regular mountain trolls. Surely this one troll will fall. But it's little things like that which are probably going to add up to disaster for the defending Numenorians. On the beach, let's see. Yeah, the trebuchet, unsurprisingly smashed by the Olakai. I have to say, it's weird, but things continue moving in the same way that they are. The beach defense may actually last longer than the defense in and around the fortress. Victory seems certain for everything. Mordor related over here, even here as well, which I find a little bit peculiar. I don't think that is actually the case. I think the Numenor Sentinels, as long as there's no intrusion on this fight, the Numenor Pikes should win this one, but it's a bit of a footnote of an engagement, that one. The big ones are the ones that matter at this stage. And it's Mordor chosen, proving to be a very reliable unit for Mordor, able to withstand punishment that many of their other units cannot. Pushing further up the hill, the Ardenheim Shadowbows doing their best, and they will beat stuff like Orca Archers, but now that the Uruk Captains have been committed forward, this fight will also probably start going against them. As chaos descends, that's exactly where Mordor will flourish. And it is a rather scattered approach. I mean, the Pharazim Swordmaster's still alive, still carving through as many orcs as they can. That surely is Diego's army. So Imladris now, I don't think they have the luxury of walking their units, you know. T.S. Niehoff does have a single unit of around 1 infantry outside, which he can use to try and act as a bit of a speed bump for Imladris if he so chooses. Ooh. The big monstrous units getting into melee, stuck underneath the bridge. I think this is a position you can put archers on as well, which is a little bit surprising actually that Numenor didn't do that, but I suppose Hidden Zed's army only had so many units in it, so you can't cover every position of the fortress as you would like. I believe this layout of the fortress is from the Teutonic expansion, if I'm not mistaken. The original Med 2. Alcarondas Faithful still trying to get in the way, but once again, I do think the Minas Morgul Chosen have been probably the most important regular unit that Mordor have had so far. Very, very dependable. And now even the anti-cavalry bonus is playing a role in the battle, preventing Numenor from getting in and amongst it. Diego has been captured. There's not much left. I mean, Numenor, I do think Imladris, as much as they have been victorious, I think they've been playing with their food a little bit out there, caught up on individual units on the flank when really reinforcements were needed far quicker over here, and that may end up being a real problem, because even if Imladris do arrive and save the day now, like I said, on the beach, I really do think that Mordor eventually, even though maybe not to the extent I was expecting, but they will still have more units arriving from the beach eventually to start also trying to occupy the fortress. Temple Executioners doing a bang-up job against the Morannon infantry units now that the javelins have run out of ammunition. Less of a concern for them. Balance of forces is evenly matched as it stands. What have we got going on over here? These are all routing units, which are actually routing the right way to continue the assault, but Medieval 2's AI will be what it is. Still these Pharazim Swordmasters though, not the easiest thing to bring down though. Units of quality and the Uruk Captains being tasked with trying to help do that now. They are going to need maybe a little bit more in the way of support though. Mordor still, I mean, on half speed it's obviously easier to be more critical of what's actually going on, which also applies to the Imladris force. To be fair, we're only 6,000 frames through the battle after all, and a Mordor army has been vanquished, so it is what it is, but the margins by which the defenders can win this battle are always going to be quite fine, so Seafarers doing a decent job on the front line, and still the initial lines of Numenorian cohorts still have a few units left in them. The Numenor quality in comparison to the Mordor one
or the Mordor level also being shown. You can see here Mordor have fought their way up the hill. Orc javelins though, orc archers. Yes, the Uruk captains are still alive, but you can see that the Mordor force is not quite the scary army that it was when it was arranged at the base of the beach. They've really been put through the ringer by the Numenorian defenders. Still the Farazim nobles as well. That is enough to rout those orc javelins, and that is a very valid way of trying to deprive Mordor of manpower. It may be the lower end units that they can do this to only at the moment, with Mordor in the ascendancy down here, but very much makes sense. Balance of forces evenly matched, so the Farazim nobles, Farazim nobles and swordmasters still fighting the good fight. Morannon archers now being used as makeshift infantry, numbers still the order of the day, and yeah, this pike force, it was always going to be interrupted by other units, and halberds surrounding them on all sides, and the trolls always good against pikes as well, so that's surely going to be the end of them. And Mordor, ever slowly, but ever so surely, going to be doing the business. Meanwhile, we've got here, Tommy the Wise does have a unit of Numenorean steel bows back here, getting in the way of T.S. Niehoff's force. Interesting to see how Imladris approach this, because they've got their archers. They're having to shoot their shots over the wall though, which, I mean, they're going to hit stuff, I suppose, when the army is this widespread. It is what it is, but the Elder do need to get in there. There can be no real hesitation here. They need to get into the fortress and start unbalancing Mordor, I would say. Victory seems certain for Numenor on this side though, so T.S. Niehoff's force with the slightly heightened level of defences that he had to advance into over here, which is another sign, I think, Imladris, if they do strike while the iron's hot on the other side, it could be onto a winner. Still the Alcarondas faithful, still alive, interestingly enough, so they've done quite well for themselves to keep themselves alive, bumping into their own units, however. Orc Maulers heading back across. T.S. Niehoff's units that he did try and send over to the other side now having to come back because they haven't quite finished their own objectives just yet. Having to go up against the very best of the brass-clad Numenorian defenders. We've got over here Orc Morannon archers in a good position on the walls. They were the last ones in, and still with a bit of ammunition as well, a bit of overwatch. And that is definitely going to be very, very useful for them. Forward come the Minas Morgul's chosen. What's going on here? Portaleno's still on his way across. The Imladris forces. Still some Numenorians in here, but Imladris are now making their way in, but enough time has passed that Portaleno has been able to set up a nice defensive line. Morannon halberds backed up by Morannon infantry. Obviously the level of quality they're having to deal with is pretty nasty, but the fact that they've managed to lay on an organised defence is something which will help them in the long run. And I think Tommy the Wise's force, Elder Lancers heading down onto the beach. I mean, this is the best place for the Lancers. Cavalry, more open field. Here the Orc Javelins surely are going to rout as soon as when the Farazim nobles make contact. So cavalry could be Mordor's worst enemy here. Still, the Numenorians, very much a skeleton crew operating as the defenders of the beach at this stage. Back across. Still shadow bows, fighting hard in melee. As I've mentioned before, I do think they're the best ranger unit in this version of the game because of the very high armour values they have as well, which is the weakness of many other rangers. Though of course with the new patch, everything will change in that regard anyway. Make use of those body-piercing arrows while you still can. Finally, the Farazim Swordmasters over here being dealt with. Shadow bows routing. And Still some Numenorian cohort over here fighting alongside the Seafarers, who are actually still winning because it's only Orc archers that they're having to fight in melee. Further uphill, Blackguard Barad-dûr victory seems certain, still doing the business. What have we got going on over here then? Pharazim nobles charging in. Maranon archers are wavering. And do rout as a result of the cavalry's attentions. This poor unit of Maranon archers is going to meet the same fate, so we'll see how effective this cavalry can be at... I don't know why they pulled out of that charge. If they continued it, they would have completely decimated that unit, and what remained would have routed off, but interesting to see how this cavalry will cause further damage to Her-Tumahai and the Warlord's armies. More Elder Runway Lancers, this unit of steel bows, finally being overwhelmed actually by this little pocket of Orc resistance which is fighting outside of the fortress. Though even if they do get into the Elder Runway archers to stop them firing, the Elder Runway will be just fine at fighting that particular fight. Narin Iron Royal Guard still fighting up on the walls. Only 10 of them remain at this point, but they did live long enough to see the Golden Tide start advancing through the gatehouse. There is actually some Temple Guard at the base of the wall here as well, but they just took a point-blank volley from the Orc javelins. Not great for them. But the quality of these Elven units in the face of all these Maranons, they may be surrounded and on the wrong side of this crescent-shaped engagement, but the quality should be enough here. We've already mentioned how strong the Elder Runway units are, especially when it comes to dealing with these basic Orcs, but will the Mordor numbers be too much in the end? The other side of the fortress, meanwhile, Numenor were still holding on, but you can see, I mean, Mordor, they've constantly had maybe the capacity to finish Numenor off, but the Numenorian quality is making that difficult, and I think Mordor really do want to finish Numenor off so they can focus entirely on the Elves. And let's not forget, of course, that chances are there will be some level of reinforcements from Mordor coming from the beach, unless the cavalry can really operate to an extremely high level. It's going to be difficult for the defenders to pull that off, but not impossible. Still the Maranon archers as well, taking plenty of ranged fire, what remains of the Temple Executioners and the Royal Legion of Armenelos. More javelins as well. So the attackers, where they have been able to, have been using their ranged support to a pretty good standard. Further back, Minas Morgul chosen. And the Beasts of Gorgoroth are still alive, amazingly enough, although they haven't really been in melee properly, only against units that were already crumbling. If they move into there, then surely the Elder Runway spears will be the death of them, you would imagine. But still, it's neat to see them alive at this stage in the battle, and not dying after a very small amount of time. Elder Runway archers trying to get into a position where they can shoot down from on high, but really they'd be better off waiting until they've cleared a bit more of a space and then get up onto the walls on the interior of the settlement. Because trying to arc your shots over the walls like this is going to be very, very difficult and not particularly efficient. Only 3 Narun Arus remain now. Still engagement on the outside. What remains of the steel bows, finally finished off by this slightly battered unit of Maranon infantry. Don't know what T.S. Niehoff will do with this kind of unit. Like I said, charging them into the Elder Runway archers won't really yield much. That unit of Elder Runway lancers could just charge into them and finish them off. In all seriousness. Pharazim nobles charging in. Surely that will be the end of this unit of Maranon archers as well. Feasting on the low-hanging fruit so far, but the fewer numbers Mordor can bring to the table in the very late game, the better chance the defenders have of leaning on their quality and winning the battle overall. But Mordor looking like they are starting to organise their forces, and the fact that they still have several units And when you combine both the Warlord and her Tumahai's remaining forces, it does constitute what is an army, really, which is a worry. The announcer seems to concur that even still, Mordor should probably go on from this position in the battle to win it. Seafarers of Nindamos finally finished off, as they did get surrounded. We are going to see a charge from the Eldaronwe Lancers, with the only real engagement now happening within the fortress. We can go back up to 1 speed when we get there, but a nice slow motion charge. The Orc Javelins are technically spears in melee, but this is still going to hurt. A downhill charge, Lancers down, the full mass of that cavalry unit connecting, and the numbers of Orc Javelins in that particular unit starts to tumble. Cavalry can still be a pain for Mordor moving up the hill, but yeah, it's going to be hard for them. So, yeah, you can see here very, very quickly the Beasts of Gorgoroth moved in to try and disrupt the Elven rhythm, but they end up all dying very, very quickly. And that's the kind of performance from the Beasts of Gorgoroth that we're used to in the current version of the game. Madness. Well, further back, Orc Javelins continuing to throw their payloads. Orc Archers as well. Mordor finally, by the looks of things, are going to have finished Numenor off, so it's going to be pretty much just the Elves left at the end here, and the sheer amount of Orcs they have to deal with means that they're probably going to get overrun here. You would suggest it was always going to be a bit of a struggle for them, and with a fast and furious battle like this, pure aggression incentivized for the Orcs, and you can see that when the players kind of only have that one option, how effective this kind of fighting can be. Eldaronwe Lancers, there are those Morannon Halberds, but maybe not the best unit to be charging into. A couple of Eldaronwe Lancer units though still, and they are going to be able to connect with the Uruk captains there. They do, but will it come at a cost? The Minas Morgul Chosen tapping up against them, a few of them will fall. Eldaronwe Lancers charging downhill. Still the Pharazim Nobles are alive. They are taking losses with each charge at this point, but just trying to do what damage they can. May only be Orc Archers this hit, but like I said, just trying to deprive Mordor of extra numbers later on may very well be the key. The only thing that the defenders can now hope for, and there's not really a huge amount of especially effective anti-cavalry units over here. There may be spears in the Orc Javelins, but while this little pocket of Mordor resistance may be weak, it's also easy to bring down, and also with most of the units being lower tier routing, also easier to cause. And I think that's Portaleno's general. So the Elves certainly causing a few problems for Mordor here. Several units starting to rout. I mean, a fair few of the numbers here are still lower end, so if all of a sudden, combined with the cavalry doing the same to the lower tier units that are still advancing up the beach, we could be starting to see a path to victory for the defenders. Another one of the generals on the beach clattered by the Eldaronwe cavalry. More of the Elves getting inside now, so the Eldaronwe Archers, if they can get up onto the walls as well, that's the sort of thing which, with a bit of extra cover, especially the extra damage that the Elven Archers have been able to do. That's one thing that the attackers have certainly done very well, managing to put their Morannon Archers up on the walls and helping to facilitate a slightly smoother advance through the settlement. Portaleno's forces struggling here. I don't know if Hidden Zed still has any of his units alive. Do they have anything left at all? Doesn't look like it. Not on the lower tier of the settlement anyway. Still some Alcarondas faithful, but nothing that would really constitute a full army. Another charge. Ooh, oof, that was very, very close. Well saved by Filler there. You can see that all of these units are making their way up, and they will try to, I guess, follow the Elves in, and then they can be surrounded between the units which already largely occupied the fort and the units which have since advanced up the beach. I mean, let's not forget that the Elves don't actually have any out-and-out bodyguard tier units. It's all Elder Enway, which is the highest tier of unit you can possibly be without being a bodyguard unit, but they don't really have anything which is on the same level as something like the Temple Executioners here. And that may end up being a problem, because I think overwhelming quality advantage is something Imladris would need if they were to go on from here to win the battle overall. Further back. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Javelins still forthcoming. Excuse me. Elven archers. Like we've already mentioned, the heavy elven archers being good in melee is always really good in the late game when everything is needed to chip in melee to be that extra boost that you need. The elves better than anyone else really at doing that. The Elder Enway archers among those numbers, though with only a one-handed sword in comparison to both Mirkwood and Lothlorien. Have those two-handed elven curved blades. Archers still. This is a really good position for the Morannon archers. The sort of thing which can really add up come the late game. Morannon infantry moving in, just trying to stifle the elven progress. Temple Executioners though being overwhelmed. I mean, the sword mass in terms of stats are very similar. It's just that lack of a second hit point. Less important for infantry than cavalry, I suppose. Still though, these Elder Enway Lancers proving to be a real pain for Mordor. But Herr Tumihai's force on the way forward. Still some Olag High. The Elven Cavalry being single HP means that if they do have to be used within the fortress, I think they would die off pretty quickly because of the tight confines of the engagement that would take place in here. Morannon archers still there. Orc archers as well, so more and more it's, well, basically they may have been, Mordor's archers have been put to good use within the walls. Really good multifaceted fight this though, the fight for the beach, the fight for the fields, and the fight for the fort, all converging now. Do the Elder Enway have what it takes? Do they have the numbers left to them? Herr Tumihai's forces making their way in. So finally some orcs from the beach made it within the walls, and the announcer seems to think that the elves have the edge, and I think looking at this, I mean, there isn't really an overwhelming number of orcs within the settlement now. They don't really have the quality to go toe-to-toe evenly with the elves either, so it may be the Elder Enway do have what it takes. There is the routing Uruk captains there. It takes a lot to rout them. One Olag High. So yeah, the cavalry's definitely done its bit. There's still some Minas Morgul's chosen. Charge missed. Yeah, I think actually a combination of routing and just not being able to match the Elder Enway in melee means that the defenders may actually go on to win this. Bit of a Pyrrhic victory for the Numenorians, I suspect, given that this is undoubtedly their island and all of their defenders have perished, but their elven support has at least made it so that Mordor's invasion does not have a foothold on the island anymore. They can reman this fortress and maybe plot their vengeance. Orc archers are routing. Yeah, if you're relying on stuff like orc archers in melee to try and take on Elder Enway, it's not going to end too well for you, is it? Off go the orc fodder now, routing Elder Enway archers as well. Elder Enway archers finally up on the walls as well. This unit of Morannon archers, which has been providing good overwatch for a while, but now will be introduced to the business end of an Elven blade. Another player admits defeat. Elven cavalry's in here. I mean, they've managed to rout them around on halberds, and cavalry can be very useful at doing that. Though this is not the sort of thing I think the Elves would have been doing if the battle was still looking a little bit bleak for them and the cavalry needed to be used a little bit more carefully. That's the gung-ho move of someone who knows that the battle has very much gone in their favour and victory is upon them. Tumihai's force, what remained of their forces, it managed to get up the beach first through the Numenorian lines and then being picked at by the cavalry, was nowhere near enough to reverse the effect that Imladris had on the fortress. I did worry that Filler had taken maybe a little bit too long, even though he, again, only 6,000 frames to get through that outer Orc army, but I did worry that the margins being what they were, given how much pressure the Numenorians were under, I did worry that it wouldn't have been enough. But in the end, I was incorrect. Arriving precisely when he means to. Another Orc general, one of the bloodied elves, slices through him. Still some Numenorians. I mean, I say some, there's one Pharazim noble. And that's it. So the battle technically ends, even though there's a few more frames left. There's one of the Alcarondas faithful over there as well. So there we have it. The frames are still ongoing, but no matter. A victory for the defenders, and in the end, well deserved, I think. There were a few worrying moments for them. Like I said, the somewhat random nature of artillery, as it can sometimes be. The trebuchet, kind of unfortunate from Tommy the Wise, really, in many cases. I mean, we'll see how many kills it managed to get, but I can't imagine that it would have been worth the amount of friendly fire that it was getting. But ultimately, managing to keep Mordor at bay for maybe longer than Mordor would have liked. And Mordor, on the beach, they found gaps, but ultimately, because of how many points they were trying to pressurise, they didn't have the infantry reserves, really, to be able to really hammer home one of the gaps, especially on the far left-hand side from the Orcs' perspective. They managed to push through there fairly quickly, but they weren't able to consolidate it with numbers. It was actually on the right-hand side with the slower burn engagement that they were ultimately able to overcome the Numenorians more consistently, and the infantry was dealt with. But following on from that, the cavalry obviously was a real problem for them. Diego was always set up for failure in many ways. Imladris were always going to be able to defeat his army outside, so he did what he could. He acted as a bit of a speed bump for Imladris on their way to try and relieve the fortress. I thought initially he'd actually done enough in terms of time bought for the Mordor Orcs to be able to take the fortress, but that wasn't really the case. And yeah, I think again, Hidden Zed within the fortress did a reasonable job, especially against T.S. Niehoff on this side of the fortress as we're looking at it, to really do a decent amount of damage to them. Ultimately, not many Numenorians are left standing at the end of this. The Elves are the ones that are, but like I said, we're on Numenor itself, so this fortress can be remanned and vengeance can be plotted. What could Mordor have done differently? I think, honestly, crashing down upon the defences on the beach with maybe a little bit more of a plan in mind beforehand, like token engagements on some of those positions, but like really heavy engagements on others, concentration of force to try and push through certain lines. It felt like they were evenly spread, and where gaps appeared they would then respond to those as they came, but I feel like being a little bit more deliberate with that would have helped, and then you would have had more reinforcements in the late game coming up from the beach, and perhaps then the Elven cavalry would also not have been in position to really start annoying you as you advanced up the hill as well. But that's really the main thing I would suggest. Other than that, it was a very good performance from the defenders, and they deserved their win here. Let's see what did the damage for the Numenorian armies. Shield Guard, some of them doing quite well, some of them getting pushed aside fairly quickly. The trebuchets, 316 kills is quite good, 153, and that's not counting the routing that they caused, so ultimately they probably were worthwhile, but again, it's a very fine margin, because when you're outnumbered as the defenders like this, friendly fire can be an absolute killer. So again, case-by-case basis, I suppose. The Numenorian cohort did very well, as you would expect, against rank-and-file Orcs. Like, they're going to be very, very strong, so not too surprising. Naryn Aru Sentinels, they did their best to hold on, but they're more of a hold the line for a long period of time kind of unit. And with this battle being so fast and furious, it was always going to be a little bit more tricky for them. Other units, again, 894 and 543 kills on the Ardenheim Shadowbows. They were the real, sort of invisible heroes, I suppose, with those blobs of Orcs appearing on the front line on the beach and doing a lot of damage there. Pharazim Swordmasters and Nobles. Pharazim Nobles, of course, again, the cavalry picking away at the orcs as they advanced up the beach after their victory was largely confirmed was also a big factor in this battle. Not the sort of things the orcs could easily overturn. As for the units within the settlement, Temple Guard did reasonably well. The Temple Executioners and Royal Legion of Armenelos in those big blob engagements were also very, very strong. Belagaya, Pikemen and Footmen we didn't really see a great deal of, actually, now that I think about it, even though one managed to get 215 kills, but perhaps they were the ones sacrificed first. And then Alcarondas Legion, several units of them, some of them doing a very good job, some of them less impressive, but considering the kind of violent engagement that it was, there can be no real complaints, especially if you do go on to win the battle. And the Narunara Royal Guard as well, ever reliable in terms of their ability to take damage as well. So yeah, big thank you to Tommy the Wise for sending this battle to me. Big thanks to all the players as well for helping him run these scenarios, because they are very much, I think, the last batch of these custom battles, along with a couple of other people that have also been making them before we get into the new patch. So it's sort of a nice way to see off this version of Reforged with, really, with some maps and scenarios that people are making for themselves. And yeah, I've got a couple more from him, actually. I've got one on what is effectively the Fords of Eisen, with Rohan against Isengard, with some elves to back up Rohan. And I've also got another one from him which escapes me. Oh no, it's a Battle for the Black Gate, so a representation of the battle from the third movie, which will be quite interesting as well. And I also have an 8-way free-for-all that was given to me by the Wound Raider, so those are the 3 battles I have not yet recorded, so over the course of the next week and a half, those will be the ones to follow on from this. I do also think that by the time this one comes out, I will be needing to do some kind of update, whether that be in the YouTube community tab, or whether that be in an actual video, or whether it be a live stream if I am able, though that is questionable these days, I would say, but we'll see. It's one of those things, like, situation chaotic. As I've mentioned several times, it's very unlikely that regardless of what happens, things are going to be affecting the channel too much. But yeah, I think it's one of those, isn't it? It's going to be an interesting time. I feel like I'm not really going to get clarity for quite a while yet. But like I said, it's not going to be something that really affects the channel too much, I would suggest. And the channel as well, with the promise of the new patch coming out at some point within 2023, hopefully sooner rather than later. I can go back to my roots a little bit in terms of content on the channel, doing faction overviews and the like. And we'll be seeing a little bit more of that. So certainly I won't be hurting for content to create, but yeah, we'll see. There's a lot that can change. It's pointless making long-term plans and such, isn't it? When things can so easily turn on a dime. But yeah, we'll see. Anyway, big thank you to Tommy the Wise, and hopefully long may these battles continue to be run and sent to me, because I do enjoy showing them. Big thanks to all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.